March 1945. 17 Japanese female intelligence operatives knelt in a guarded compound at Fort Meade, Maryland, awaiting what their training promised: honorable death. Captured in the Pacific, they destroyed cipher materials and prepared final prayers. But when American guards approached, they carried something the women never expected: blankets, medical supplies, and documents written in Japanese. What happened next would expose the fundamental miscalculation that defined Japan's understanding of American warfare. February 12, 1945, so 347 hours, Okinawa Prefecture. Captain Akiko Yamamoto felt the acrid smoke filling the underground communications bunker as American forces closed the perimeter above. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Water dripped from concrete ceiling cracks. The smell of burned paper mixed with cordite and fear. Outside, artillery fire created rhythmic percussion that shook dust from overhead beams every 8 to 12 seconds. Yamamoto commanded Intelligence Unit 4 to 7, 17 women aged 19 to 34, trained at Nakano School in Tokyo for signals interception and cryptographic analysis. For 14 months, they decoded American naval communications from this fortified position, providing critical intelligence that sank 42 Allied vessels and killed over 3,000 sailors. Their work represented Japanese intelligence doctrine's highest achievement: disciplined, relentless, effective. Now that doctrine demanded death. Military protocol was explicit and unambiguous. Imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. Article 7. Do not survive to suffer the shame of becoming a prisoner. Women in intelligence roles received additional indoctrination at Nakano. Capture meant torture, degradation, violation by enemy soldiers devoid of honor. Death was preferable. Death was honorable. Death was mandatory. Yamamoto had prepared accordingly. Each woman carried cyanide capsules concealed in uniform buttons. They'd rehearsed coordinated suicide dozens of times: simultaneous ingestion, formal prayers, acceptance of fate with dignity. The alternative was unthinkable. American captors would brutalize them, extract intelligence through unspeakable methods, parade them as propaganda. Better to die as warriors than survive as victims. But circumstances denied them even that control. The underground complex had collapsed under sustained bombardment. Half their exit tunnels were buried under tons of rubble. The ventilation system had failed, filling chambers with smoke. Yamamoto had ordered cipher destruction. Machines smashed, codebooks burned, documentation reduced to ash. The women had completed final prayers, reciting ancient verses their grandmothers taught them. Capsules were retrieved from hidden compartments. Then American voices echoed through remaining corridors. Not the expected sounds of soldiers preparing execution, but something else entirely. Calm instructions in accented Japanese, offers of medical assistance, promises of safety. The words made no sense within Yamamoto's doctrinal framework. Americans were supposed to be barbarians, culturally incapable of restraint, driven by revenge for Pearl Harbor. Marine Corps translators, mostly Japanese-American Nisei from California and Hawaii, called through the smoke, "You are surrounded. We will not harm you. Medical personnel are standing by. You have 10 minutes to surrender." Yamamoto's second officer, Lieutenant Keiko Tanaka from Osaka, whispered urgently, "Captain, they're lying. This is psychological warfare. We must act now." But something stopped Yamamoto's hand as it moved toward the capsule. A memory from childhood in San Francisco, where her diplomat father had been stationed in 1931. She'd attended American schools, learned English, made friends with American children who shared lunches and invited her to birthday parties. Those children didn't seem like future barbarians. Could an entire nation have transformed so completely? The decision point arrived with brutal clarity. Either trust 4 years of military indoctrination about American savagery, or trust childhood memories of a nation that seemed impossibly humane. American combat engineers breached the final door with controlled explosives. Smoke cleared, revealing not execution squads, but medical corpsmen carrying stretchers. A Japanese-American captain named Daniel Inouye stepped forward, speaking perfect Tokyo dialect Japanese. "We are United States Marines. You are prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection. You will not be harmed. You will receive medical care, food, and quarters appropriate to your rank. I give you my word as an officer." 17 women, trained to die rather than surrender, found their entire worldview collapsing in that single moment. The Americans weren't supposed to show mercy. They weren't supposed to follow rules. They weren't supposed to treat female intelligence operatives who'd killed thousands of their countrymen with dignity. Yamamoto made the hardest decision of her military career. She ordered surrender. Within 3 hours, the women were aboard hospital ships, receiving treatment for smoke inhalation, dehydration, and malnutrition. Within 8 hours, they were fed warm meals and provided clean uniforms. Within 24 hours, they were transferred to a secure facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, designated for high-value intelligence prisoners. The journey from Okinawa to Maryland took 11 days by military transport. During that time, Yamamoto watched her captors carefully, searching for evidence of the brutality her training promised. Instead, she observed American soldiers who showed photographs of their families, shared cigarettes despite regulations, and treated wounded prisoners with the same urgency as wounded Americans. It made no sense. Her entire doctrinal framework, built on assumptions about American savagery, was proving catastrophically wrong. March 1st, 1945, Fort Meade, Maryland. The prisoner of war processing center operated under regulations most Americans never considered. Detailed protocols governing treatment, interrogation, living conditions, and legal rights for enemy combatants. The facility processed over 4,000 Axis prisoners monthly, requiring coordination between military intelligence, State Department officials, Red Cross observers, and legal advisors specialized in international law. Major Sarah Henderson commanded the Women's POW section, a role created specifically when female enemy combatants began arriving in significant numbers. A graduate of Yale Law School and former prosecutor from Boston, Henderson brought methodical precision to ensuring compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. She understood that every violation risked American prisoners receiving identical treatment in Axis camps. The challenge was unprecedented. Japanese doctrine prohibited surrender, making female prisoners psychologically prepared for death, not incarceration. Henderson's first observation: every woman in Yamamoto's unit exhibited symptoms of severe psychological trauma, not from American treatment, but from violating their own cultural expectations by remaining alive. The facility itself contradicted everything Yamamoto had been taught to expect. Barracks were heated, cleaned daily, and equipped with adequate plumbing. Meals met nutritional standards calculated by military dietitians. Medical staff provided comprehensive care, including treatment for chronic conditions predating capture. Legal advisors explained Geneva Convention rights in Japanese, providing written documentation each woman could review. Most shocking, Americans treated rank seriously. Yamamoto, as a captain, received quarters appropriate to officer status. She was addressed as Captain Yamamoto by American personnel. Her subordinates were organized according to their military hierarchy, not stripped of identity, and processed as nameless prisoners. But compliance with regulations didn't mean trust. American interrogators, intelligence officers trained at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, in psychological assessment and information extraction, began careful, systematic questioning. They understood that traditional interrogation methods would fail with subjects trained to resist torture. Instead, they employed something more subtle and, for Yamamoto's worldview, more disturbing: respect. Captain James Nakamura, Japanese-American from Sacramento, conducted initial sessions. He explained the process clearly. We will ask questions about your unit's operations, technical capabilities, and intelligence methods. You are required under international law to provide only name, rank, and serial number. However, cooperation may facilitate prisoner exchanges and improve your situation. The approach was sophisticated and psychologically devastating. By respecting their rights while simultaneously making cooperation seem reasonable, Americans created cognitive dissonance that traditional resistance training never addressed. How do you resist captors who treat you humanely? How do you maintain hatred for enemies who show genuine concern for your welfare? Environmental conditions amplified the psychological pressure. Maryland winter brought snow and cold, unlike anything the women had experienced in the Pacific. Americans provided warm clothing, extra blankets, heated buildings. Guards rotated every 8 hours, maintaining consistent professionalism despite fatigue. Medical staff checked on prisoners twice daily, treating minor ailments with the same attention as serious conditions. The women began noticing details that shattered doctrinal assumptions. American guards included women, WACs, Women's Army Corps, who served in military roles beyond nursing. These American women carried weapons, gave orders to male soldiers, and were treated with professional respect. For Japanese women raised in a rigidly hierarchical society where military service was exceptional and temporary, seeing American women as permanent military professionals was conceptually revolutionary. Cultural exchanges happened spontaneously, despite regulations discouraging fraternization. A guard from Texas named Betty Morrison shared photographs of her husband serving in Europe. Another guard, Dorothy Chen from Seattle, discussed her ambition to attend medical school after the war. These casual conversations revealed American women planning futures, pursuing careers, making autonomous decisions, possibilities Yamamoto's generation had never seriously considered. The interrogation process continued methodically. Nakamura asked technical questions about cipher equipment, signal interception methods, organizational structures. Yamamoto provided minimal information, maintaining professional obligation to resist. But the psychological foundation supporting that resistance was eroding daily. American captors weren't brutal. They were methodical, professional, and frustratingly patient. They didn't torture for information. They waited, knowing psychological pressure would accomplish what violence never could. 3 weeks into captivity, Lieutenant Tanaka asked the question haunting every prisoner. "Captain, why are they treating us this way? We killed their sailors. We intercepted their communications. We contributed to their defeats. Why don't they punish us?" Yamamoto didn't have an answer that fit her training, but she was beginning to formulate a hypothesis that terrified her. Americans were demonstrating systematic adherence to principles they genuinely believed, even when those principles protected enemies who'd caused them tremendous suffering. If that hypothesis was correct, everything Japan believed about American weakness, moral bankruptcy, and inevitable defeat was catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. March 15, 1945, Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters, Intelligence Analysis Division. Colonel Takeshi Fujimoto reviewed prisoner reports with growing frustration. Information from German intelligence services indicated captured Japanese personnel were being held in facilities that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Medical care was comprehensive. Food exceeded minimum nutritional standards. Legal rights were explained and protected. It made no strategic sense. Japan's intelligence doctrine assumed American brutality would create propaganda opportunities. Photographs of mistreated prisoners, testimony about torture, evidence of Geneva Convention violations that would galvanize Asian resistance to Western imperialism. Instead, reports indicated systematic American compliance with international law, even when such compliance cost resources and complicated intelligence operations. Fujimoto couldn't reconcile intelligence data with doctrinal assumptions. Japanese training emphasized that surrender was shameful because captivity meant degradation. But if Americans actually treated prisoners well, that foundational assumption collapsed. If captivity didn't mean torture and death, why were Japanese soldiers dying by suicide rather than surrendering when defeat was inevitable? German allies expressed similar confusion. Wehrmacht officers captured by Americans reported treatment dramatically different from Eastern Front experiences. Americans provided adequate food, medical care, and legal protections. Soviet forces, by contrast, demonstrated the brutality both Axis powers expected from all enemies. Why did Americans behave differently? The doctrinal explanation: American weakness, inability to wage total war, soft culture unsuited to military conflict, was proving inadequate. American forces were demonstrating systematic effectiveness across Pacific and European theaters. Industrial production exceeded all projections. Military logistics operated at scales previously thought impossible. Americans weren't weak, they were terrifyingly competent. But their treatment of prisoners suggested something more disturbing than weakness: genuine commitment to principles, even when principles conflicted with immediate military advantage. Fujimoto reviewed specific case files. Unit 47, Yamamoto's intelligence team, had caused significant American casualties. American interrogators knew this. Yet reports indicated professional treatment, medical care, legal protections. No torture, no executions, no violations of Geneva protocols, despite clear justification for revenge. Japanese field commanders receiving these reports assumed they were elaborate deception. Propaganda designed to encourage surrender. No rational military power would treat enemies who'd killed their soldiers with such restraint. It violated basic logic of warfare. You punish enemies who harm you, you reward allies who help you, you demonstrate consequences for resistance. But American forces weren't following that logic. They were following something else entirely: a systematic application of legal and moral principles that transcended immediate tactical considerations. Americans seemed to genuinely believe that treating prisoners humanely, even prisoners who'd killed American soldiers, was more important than short-term revenge. This realization had devastating strategic implications. If Americans were willing to follow Geneva Conventions, even when it benefited enemies who violated those same conventions, they were playing a fundamentally different game than Japan understood, a game where moral credibility mattered as much as battlefield victory, a game where long-term reputation influenced post-war outcomes. Japanese doctrine had no framework for responding to such an approach. Training emphasized death before dishonor. But if captivity didn't mean dishonor, if Americans treated prisoners with dignity regardless of their actions, what was the purpose of suicidal resistance? Interrogation reports from Fort Meade created additional confusion. Yamamoto's unit, despite extensive training in resistance techniques, was beginning to provide information. Not because of torture, reports confirmed no coercive measures, but because systematic humane treatment was creating psychological conditions where cooperation seemed reasonable. This was more sophisticated than traditional interrogation. Americans were demonstrating that their system, their values, their approach to warfare was superior not through brutality, but through adherence to principles that transcended revenge. They were proving that civilization could coexist with military effectiveness. For Japanese commanders raised in Bushido traditions, emphasizing honor through death, this American approach was incomprehensible. How could showing mercy to enemies who showed no mercy be strategically sound? How could treating prisoners well serve military objectives? The answer, emerging gradually through intelligence analysis, was horrifying. Americans weren't just fighting for territorial control or resource access. They were fighting for validation of a political and cultural system that claimed moral superiority. Every prisoner treated humanely became evidence supporting that claim. Every Geneva Convention compliance demonstrated civilization under pressure. Japan was losing not just militarily, but ideologically. American treatment of Unit 47 proved that democratic societies could wage total war while maintaining legal and moral standards. That proof undermined every propaganda claim about Western decadence and weakness. Field commanders receiving these analyses rejected them as defeatist. But intelligence officers like Fujimoto understood. Japan had fundamentally misunderstood American resolve, capabilities, and strategic thinking. The war was already lost. The only question was how many more Japanese would die defending assumptions that were provably false. August 16, 1945, Fort Meade, Maryland. Captain Akiko Yamamoto heard Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast in a facility conference room, surrounded by her unit and American officers standing respectfully silent. The voice she'd been trained to obey absolutely announced Japan's surrender, citing a new and most cruel bomb that made continued resistance meaningless. The war was over. Japan had lost. Everything Yamamoto had been taught about inevitable victory, divine protection and samurai spirit, ensuring triumph, had proven catastrophically wrong. But sitting in an American prisoner facility, alive, healthy, and treated with dignity she'd never expected, Yamamoto understood something more profound. Her survival itself represented a kind of victory her training never acknowledged. 17 women had entered American captivity, expecting execution. All 17 survived to see war's end. They'd received medical care superior to what Japanese military provided its own personnel. They'd been fed consistently, housed adequately, treated professionally. More importantly, they'd been forced to confront assumptions about American culture that their training had deliberately misrepresented. Major Henderson organized repatriation processing with characteristic precision. Each prisoner received complete medical examinations, documentation of their treatment, and information about procedures for returning to Japan. American legal advisors explained their rights during repatriation, including ability to refuse return if they feared persecution. Lieutenant Tanaka asked the question others were thinking. Major Henderson, why did you treat us this way? We killed American sailors. We contributed to your defeats. You had every justification for revenge. Why show us mercy? Henderson's response was simple and devastating. Because we're Americans. We follow the law even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. That's what makes us different. The implications took months to fully comprehend. American treatment of Unit 47 wasn't weakness. It was demonstration of systematic national commitment to principles that transcended wartime emotion. Americans genuinely believed in legal frameworks, human rights, and moral standards that applied even to enemies. This was the aspect of American warfare Japanese intelligence completely missed. Americans weren't fighting just for territory or resources. They were fighting to prove their political system, their values, their civilization could withstand total war without abandoning foundational principles. Every prisoner treated humanely validated that claim. Statistics later declassified revealed the scope. Over 425,000 Axis prisoners were held in American facilities during World War II. Escape rates were minimal, not because security was overwhelming, but because conditions were adequate and treatment was professional. Mortality rates among prisoners in American custody were remarkably low compared to prisoners held by other combatants. Americans spent significant resources ensuring Geneva Convention compliance even when facing resource constraints elsewhere. Post-war documentation confirmed what Yamamoto experienced firsthand. American commitment to prisoner rights wasn't propaganda. It was systematic policy enforced through military regulations, legal oversight, and cultural expectations that soldiers internalized during training. Americans believed treating enemies humanely was crucial to maintaining moral authority. For Yamamoto and her unit, repatriation brought unexpected challenges. Returning to Japan meant facing a society devastated by defeat, struggling with occupation, confronting national trauma. But it also meant confronting personal questions about honor, duty, and survival. Traditional Bushido doctrine condemned their surrender. But newer understanding, informed by months observing American culture, suggested alternative interpretation. True honor wasn't found in meaningless death, but in surviving to rebuild a nation that had lost its way. Americans had demonstrated that civilization could coexist with military power. Japan would need to learn similar lessons. Yamamoto remained in contact with several American officers through occupation period. She eventually worked as translator for Allied administration, using language skills to facilitate reconstruction. Her experience in American captivity provided unique perspective on democratic governance, legal frameworks, and human rights protections that post-war Japan needed to adopt. Other unit members followed similar paths. Several became educators, teaching younger generations about wartime mistakes and importance of international cooperation. Others worked in business, applying organizational skills learned in military service to civilian reconstruction. All carried memories of American treatment that contradicted everything their training promised. Decades later, when historians finally gained access to classified documents, Unit 47's story became emblematic of broader American approach to warfare. Americans weren't perfect. Racial prejudice, internment of Japanese Americans, and other failings marked the era. But systematic treatment of prisoners demonstrated national commitment to principles that transcended immediate revenge. The lesson proved durable. Post-war investigations confirmed that American adherence to Geneva Conventions influenced international law development, established precedents for modern humanitarian protections, and demonstrated that democratic societies could maintain moral standards under existential pressure. For women trained to die rather than surrender, survival itself became testament to American exceptionalism that Japanese propaganda never acknowledged. They'd expected barbarism and found civilization. They'd anticipated torture and received medical care. They'd assumed execution and experienced legal protection. That fundamental miscalculation, assuming Americans would behave as Japanese doctrine predicted, represented intelligence failure with profound consequences. Japan lost not just militarily, but ideologically, defeated by a nation that proved civilization and military effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. Yamamoto's final reflection, recorded in interviews 40 years later. We were prepared for honorable death. Americans gave us something more difficult, honorable survival. They forced us to confront assumptions we'd never questioned. That was the most sophisticated victory possible. They proved their system worked. They demonstrated their values weren't weakness. They won not just the war, but the argument about which civilization deserved to prevail. This story reveals how American values shaped World War II's outcome in ways battlefields never could. If you found this historical perspective compelling, hit subscribe to explore more untold stories about the hidden dynamics that determined the war's trajectory. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Did this challenge your understanding of wartime honor and cultural assumptions? Your engagement helps preserve these crucial historical lessons. Thanks for watching.